In the 20 years or so that I've been coming to this church, many things have been constant for me. Inspiring sermons, the delight of teaching RE, connecting with good people, and anxiety about the annual stewardship drive. I don't want to go too deep into my conflicted relationship with money and the tension between feelings of scarcity and plenty. As a long-term freelancer and sole provider for my family, financial concern has been my steady companion even when times were good. Imagine then the surprise my past self would have felt when I decided unasked to join the stewardship team. I'm still freelance, and like all of us, weathering the financial uncertainty of life in a pandemic. I'm older and, thankfully, wiser, but money is still money and fear is still fear. So, why am I here today talking to you about stewardship? I've had the privilege for the last few years to be moderator of this congregation. That role has given me many gifts, one of them being a much deeper understanding of how this congregation works. Budgeting has been a big part of that. I'll give you a quick peek behind the budget curtain. This time of year, the board comes up with our guidance for the year. We pass that on to the executive team, who is responsible for making the budget. The ET does their best to figure out what all will be needed for the year, and they come up with a number. And then stewardship happens, and we get a different number, the amount of money that was pledged. And then we look at the pledges, and we make the adjustments needed to achieve a key board priority, having a balanced budget. All of the budgets that I've been involved in have been COVID budgets, tinged with uncertainty about our individual and collective financial health. Our goals have been modest. In addition to a balanced budget, we maintain a healthy reserve. Last year, we budgeted some money to allow hybrid services to happen. So we invested a little bit more in some gear and some hours for our fabulous tech folks. There is one more priority that the board and the ET have had that we've not been able to meet. The Unitarian Universalist Association, the national body for our denomination, publishes guidance each year with recommended salary and benefits for staff. These are pegged to our location and our congregation size. They give a range: minimum for people who are for ministers and staff who are at the start of their career, median for experienced staff who are proficient at their jobs, and maximum for staff at the peak of their career. Reverend Marcia, who is in her 7th year as our minister and 12th year of her career, is certainly proficient. She has been hanging on to the minimum level for the past few years. Mary, our director of religious education, came to us 6 years ago. She has a PhD and is in the 11th year of experience, and 11 years of experience. She is being paid at a level recommended for entry-level staff. This is no one's fault, and the staff is not mad about this. But it is a fact that our dedicated, passionate, and deeply experienced staff are currently being paid as beginners. Speaking for the leadership of your church, it is time to change that. I've had the privilege of seeing our staff up close, in action, in ordinary times and extraordinary times. The pandemic turned all of our lives upside down. The same is true for our staff. They had to figure out how to do church in a whole new way, how to keep our community together remotely, how to care for our hearts and our minds and our building and our finances in a whole new way. And they did it week after week, crisis after crisis. And they did it so well never letting us down. Your board feels it is a matter of respect and of social justice to pay our staff at a level that matches their experience and their ability. The only way to do that is by increasing our pledges. We can turn our appreciation, our respect, our love for our staff into action by increasing our pledges to allow us to pay them fairly. At the last annual meeting, you were presented with good reasons to allow me to stay on as moderator for one more year, and you voted to do so. There was one more reason I wanted to stay on. After 2 years of budget guidance recommending we pay our staff better, and 2 years of not being able to do that, I wanted to try again, and try differently. So I stayed on, I joined the stewardship team, and now I stand here as a congregant, a teacher, a board member, a person whose heart has been sheltered and nourished by this congregation, by this staff, to tell you that it's time to make a change. One of my favorite things I've learned from Reverend Marcia is that we don't need to have all the answers. We just need to do the next right thing. It is time to say to our staff, we see you. We see your passion. We appreciate your devotion. We value your excellence. And now it is time for us to do the next right thing and show our staff how much we appreciate them, how much we value them by choosing to increase our pledges to pay them fairly. It is right, it is just, and it is time. You should be receiving your pledge packet in the mail in the next few days. If you can, please join me in increasing your pledge to make this change happen for our wonderful staff. Thank you.
When I started thinking about my reflection for this week, I noticed that this month's theme for church is renewing faith. So when I started thinking about that, what do I mean when I say those words? Was I looking for faith when I came here? Had I lost faith? Perhaps for some, but for me, and perhaps for others, being here has been a process of redefining what I mean. We had faith all along. We just became uncomfortable with the box it came in. Seems to be a common pattern. As kids, we were raised in a particular faith community. For many, that meant weekly or even more frequent visits to church. Some that included regular morning mass. Some of us got our schooling in religious schools. Some of us went to colleges that were founded by churches, and attendance at chapel was required. We learned our faith by all of these means, and by osmosis from the world around us. We learned the principles of our faith, excuse me, even if it meant going to service only a few times a year, Christmas and Easter. We absorbed the basic tenets of our community, of the community we were part of. But for many, late teens, early 20s are a time from breaking away from those patterns we established as kids. For many, this is a quiet drifting away. We're busy with school, jobs, marriage. Regular attendance erodes to an occasional visit. And then even that is gone for many. For some, it's a deliberate rejection of what we grew up with. A resolution to have nothing to do with that past. This may be followed by a period of years, even decades, with no formal links to a an organized religious community. I'm sure I'd find a number of you who were raised in a church but then spent many years, perhaps even decades, 3 in my case, without going to a church at all, except for weddings and funerals. If asked, many would acknowledge a belief in God or some higher power, but nothing beyond that. But then, here we are. We Unitarian Universalists have made it hard for ourselves. Religions with a clear statement of faith make things easy. Here's the package. Take it or leave it. This is what you need to believe. You may have questions about parts of it. Some parts may be open to some interpretation, but basically, you have to accept the whole package. But Unitarian Universalism is non-creedal. There is no statement of faith. We have our 7 principles, maybe soon 8. And for the most part, they should be acceptable as guides to live by. Although I do know of one UU minister who does not believe in the first principle. He says, there are some people that I just cannot believe that there is any worth and dignity for. So, as I said, we make it hard for ourselves. Far from being a church where you can believe anything you want, we ask ourselves to think carefully about what we believe. We need to examine each principle. What does it mean to me? How can I best apply it to my actions? But if we truly do that, we know that our faith is just that. It's ours, not something imposed from outside, but part of us.
So for a few years, I lived in eastern Massachusetts. I lived on the South Shore. So if you picture Boston and you start to go down the coast towards Cape Cod, that's the area I lived in. And this part of Massachusetts is not far from where John Adams was born and grew up and had his family home. And you might imagine I was delighted this morning to realize that this church is at the corner of 6th and John Adams Street. Because in my family, we are big history nerds, and sometimes we have been big presidential history nerds. And during our years in Massachusetts, we were very into presidents. So we went to the Adams National Historical Park in Quincy, Massachusetts. And we saw the tiny old house where John Adams was born and grew up. And then we walked, about 20 feet across the grass, and we saw the tiny old house where John and Abigail Adams lived as newlyweds, literally able to step out their front door and say, hello, to John's parents. And then we got on the Park Service bus and we went across Quincy to the grounds of Peacefield, the farm with the large home that John and Abigail lived in when they returned after their time in England negotiating the peace treaty that ended the American Revolutionary War. And then finally, we climbed back onto the bus, we went back into downtown Quincy, and we walked a couple blocks to the Unitarian Universalist Church in that town, which is known as United First Parish Church. It is built of granite. It's an incredible stone building. And when you come in to take the tour, the volunteers tell you this building was built in part by the Adams family. It was the church where John and Abigail Adams worshiped. It was the church where their children grew up, and where their son, John Quincy Adams, and his wife, Louisa Catherine Adams, worshiped and helped to raise the money to finish the construction. Now, just as John Adams was the 2nd president of the United States, you might remember that John Quincy Adams was the 6th president of the United States. So when you visit our congregation in Quincy, Massachusetts, they invite you to go and sit in the pew where John and Abigail Adams sat. And then they invite you to come down to the basement of the church where there is a crypt and where John and Abigail Adams and John Quincy and Louisa Catherine Adams are entombed, and you can pay your respects to these Unitarian presidents. And I told you we were big nerds, so we did it all. Now, I will refrain from telling you too many stories about these presidents and first ladies who share our religious tradition. I'm just going to tell you 2. Here's the first one. John Quincy Adams thought that oak trees were the best trees in the entire world. He loved them, he was fascinated by them, and in fact, he took this beautiful, probably expensive crystal bowl and planted an acorn in some dirt in the bowl because he wanted to be able to see through the sides how the root ball was growing, and he cracked the bowl in doing so. I do not imagine the rest of his household was very pleased with this, but this is how much John Quincy Adams loved oak trees. And he lived in Washington, D.C. for many years. He was elected as a senator, he served as a Secretary of State, he was a president, and then, unusually, after his presidency, he did not retire. He was elected as a representative, and so he kept right on serving. And when John Quincy Adams walked the streets of Washington, D.C., he would reach into his bag and pull out acorns, and he would fling them everywhere he went. Into the parks, into the empty fields, into people's lawns. He wanted to plant oak trees for all the generations to come to enjoy. And the second story. At Peacefield, that big, grand home, the home of presidents, the summer home of John Adams during his presidency, the home of John Quincy Adams. When John and Abigail first moved in, Abigail Adams hung a horseshoe over the doorway. And you in the room have paper horseshoes. If you're on Zoom, you'll have to imagine you have a horseshoe. How do you think she hung that horseshoe? Now, I see a lot of guesses she hung it points up, but no, Abigail hung the horseshoe points down. She felt that her family had enough luck. She wanted it to pour out on all the visitors to their home, all the friends and family who came through their door. Now, the whole concept of enoughness is often hard for us here in the 21st century. We are used to excessive amounts of things being available in the world, and we're used to being wrapped in this consumer narrative that says we never have enough. And this is the story that a mentality of scarcity tells us. There's not enough of the good stuff, the scarcity story says. And you know it's the good stuff because there's not very much of it. So when you get a chance to grab some, you should grab it and keep it for yourself. There's definitely not enough to go around. If there was lots of something, it probably wouldn't be very good, right? And this is a stressful way to live. It keeps us always worried about getting enough of the limited resources. It's how a lot of us relate to money. We heard some of this from Greg's stewardship moment earlier. A lot of us worry, do we have enough? And when we come to these stewardship Sundays in our congregations, sometimes we get extra nervous because what if I don't have enough? And what if that means that I am not enough? I remember vividly feeling that way the first time I pledged to a Unitarian Universalist congregation. I was a grad student. I was attending the congregation in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and I was singing in the choir, so there was no way that I was going to be able to sneak out in the middle of the service. We sat in chairs right up front on the chancel. Everybody could see. And it was one of those services where you got your pledge card during the service, and you were supposed to fill it out on the spot and turn it in. And I took that orange piece of paper, and my heart started racing. I kind of held it out like maybe it was going to bite me, because I didn't know what I was going to write on that pledge card. And I kind of fumbled through the Fair Share giving guide that was tucked into my order of service, and I looked at all those suggested numbers, and I picked the smallest one, and I wrote it down, and I folded my pledge card in half. And I folded it again, and I folded it again. so it was small. So nobody could see the number that I had written on it, and I threw it into the basket. And I felt awful, because I was afraid that what I had to give was not enough, and that somebody would see it, and they would know that I was not enough. Now, fast forward to a few years later, where, like Greg, I had made the improbable decision to serve on a stewardship committee despite this experience. And I knew that being on the stewardship committee meant that I would need to carefully consider the pledge my household and I would make, so that I could say to others, as I invited them to pledge, yes, I have pledged already. And I knew I did not want it to feel like it had felt to pledge in those grad school years. So this time I didn't start by thinking about the annual amount I could pledge, because that really hadn't worked for me. I sat down with my spouse and I said, what do you think we could give each month? What do you think we could manage out of our monthly budget? And we arrived at a number that felt good to us, and then we multiplied it by 12. And I was astonished. It was more than double that pledge that had felt almost unreachable those years before. I felt like I was a person with something to give. Now, we weren't going to be in the top quartile of pledgers or anything like that, but it was a pretty good pledge, especially for folks on a tight budget with a new baby at home. I felt like, yeah, okay, we can pledge this. And not only did I feel good about it, I felt excited about it. I felt joyful. I felt like I was more than enough. Once upon a time, back in college, I took an economics class. And I don't remember that much from it, honestly. But I do remember that microeconomics is the study of what individual people do. And macroeconomics is very similar, because enough people acting together essentially act like one big person. And if there are actual economists in the room or on Zoom, I beg your pardon. I'm summarizing the best I can. I'm sure it's not correct. But I like to think about this during stewardship season, because if each one of you makes a pledge that helps you to feel that you are enough, that you are joyful, that you are free, imagine what it does to your congregation as an entity to help all of you know that you are more than enough, that you are joyful, that you are free. And because I am invested in Unitarian Universalism, I am invested in you feeling this way, even though I do not serve this congregation. I want you to know that you are enough. And probably you have enough, even if you don't have everything that advertising tries to convince you that you should have. And if there are times when you don't have enough, it is all the more important to be connected in community, to know that you are worthy to be included in the flow of what we share. The flip side of scarcity is abundance, the worldview that sees our lives as overflowing with gifts. The abundance worldview tells us that what is everywhere is, in fact, precious, not just what is scarce. I remember a documentary in which a Canadian First Nations man was telling how to make a rattle, which was used in ceremony. And he said, the sound of the rattle is everywhere in nature, which is how we know that it is the voice of the Creator. Because it is common, it is known to be sacred. Robin Wall Kimmerer, author of the beautiful book Braiding Sweetgrass, an author and teacher who brings together indigenous and scientific ways of knowing, invites us into something even beyond abundance. She invites us into a life of reciprocity, a life that recognizes the gifts we have been given and the gifts we give in return, a life that asks us to pay attention to the flow of these gifts. In her essay, The Honorable Harvest, Kimmerer writes about harvesting wild leeks. She says, I address the plants in the way I've been taught, introducing myself in case they've forgotten, even though we've been meeting like this for years. I explain why I've come, and I ask their permission to harvest, inquiring politely if they would be willing to share. She tells about digging her trowel into the soil, working hard to get into the tightly packed ground, and finally she pulls out a clump of leeks. And then she says, I expected a cluster of fat white bulbs, but in their place I find ragged, papery sheaths where bulbs should be. Withered and flaccid, they look as if all the juice has been sucked out of them, which it has. And if you ask permission, you have to listen to the answer. I tuck them back into the soil and go home. Asking permission shows respect for the personhood of the plant, but it is also an assessment of the well-being of the population. Thus, I must use both sides of my brain to listen to the answer. The analytical left reads the empirical signs to judge whether the population is large and healthy enough to sustain a harvest, whether it has enough to share. The intuitive right hemisphere is reading something else, a sense of generosity, an open-handed radiance that says, take me, or sometimes a tight-lipped recalcitrance that makes me put my trowel away. I can't explain it, but it is a kind of knowing. What kind of knowing led Abigail Adams to hang that horseshoe, points down? Is it related to the kind of knowing that tells Robin Wall Kimmerer which bunch of leeks to harvest and which to leave to keep growing? Does it have to do with the kind of knowing that sends Kimmerer out later in the spring after she has harvested wild leeks to plant a few in new places? What would it look like for us to develop habits of pausing in all parts of our lives to notice where we have enough and where we might choose to share? That might mean making sure not to take the last of something at the grocery store. It might mean posting on a neighborhood group to let your neighbors know what you have a little extra of and would be happy to drop off at their doorsteps. It might mean looking over your household finances and noticing that if your household is doing okay right now, you can give some money to help those who are struggling. And when you pause to fill out your pledge card, check in with your sense of enoughness. Can you share generously, maybe in ways that surprise and delight you, which can happen regardless of the dollar amount you are writing? We've talked about the way in which knowing that we have enough and that we are enough makes us each freer and all of us freer. And that is true for your staff, too. The folks who dedicate so many hours and so much energy to the thriving of this congregation. All too often, that creeping fear of not enough, that fear creeps its way into our church budgets, too. And it means that all too often, church staff don't get the compensation that they need to support their sense of being free and joyful and more than enough. And that makes all of us a little less free. Macroeconomics, right? And when we are joyful, we spread that joy. We can be like John Quincy Adams, walking the streets of Washington, D.C., and flinging out the acorns that bring us joy and that we hope will grow into the trees that bring joy to the generations yet to come. We can be like Abigail Adams, knowing that her family had enough luck to share, and hanging that horseshoe points down to pour out the luck on her friends. What is it that you are hoping to grow? What is it that you have enough of? And what will you pour out for the good of us all? If you are in the room, you have a paper horseshoe, and I want to invite you to take a few moments to think about what it is that you have enough of to pour out. You can write it on your horseshoe. If you are joining us on Zoom, you may need to make your own horseshoe. You can sketch it on a piece of paper. Just make a nice arc and write on it. What is it that life has brought to you in abundance that you would like to pour out for us all?